Hello, fictional. Welcome to the What If Issei. Today we are gonna see, what if Issei become a dragon of ruin? Part 2. If you end up liking this video, please consider subscribe, so without further ado, let's get into the video. Ria's Gremory, sitting at her desk in the occult research club room, trying her best not to freak out, could only think of one thing. Those shadows. She had heard stories of a power that gave the user control of the shadows, along with a frightening aura. It was so rare that she had not even thought of it when she came across Issei. Especially since the last user anyone had heard of was well over a century ago. Though it had been far longer than that since there was a user capable of handling the power for more than a few minutes before going completely insane. No wonder she couldn't find it in the main Sacred Gear books, none of them included it. So little was known about it that it was disputed in the supernatural community whether it was a Sacred Gear or not. None of this boded well for Issei Hyoudou. One of the first few recorded and by far the strongest user had killed a lot of devils in its time. Several of the pillar families would want Issei's head. For crimes he did not commit. She knew she should call her brother and get help. That would by far be the best course of action. But she refused to. Let it be known that Ria's Gremory, for all her kindness and empathy, was still a devil. A very young, high-class devil. As such, she was insanely prideful. In the end, she decided she would decide what to do next based on Issei's state when he wakes up. Once again, Issei found himself waking up on a couch. He didn't have to look around to know he was in the clubroom again. Greg, you're awake. Yeah, what happened? Do you not remember? Clearly not. You were torturing the fallen angel before you collapsed. You appear to have a new power. What was it? I do not know. How could you not know? Haven't you seen all of these before? Not this one. How is that? Because it is not of the boosted gear. You appear to have a separate power entirely, Hyoudou. Is that even possible? In theory, yes. It is best if you talk to Gremory about it further. Memories from the night flooded back into Issei's mind. He shot up. Thankfully, there wasn't any pain in his side this time when he stood up. He took a few steps, and a splitting headache made itself known, the effect of it almost knocking him off his feet. He put his hand on the wall to steady himself. When he got to the door and opened it, Ria's wasn't the only one there this time. The entire occult research club were there with her. They were all enjoying tea. But someone else. Asia Argento barely had time to stand up before she was engulfed in a hug. You're alive. How are you alive? He asked. Ria's brought me back. Her response was muffled by Issei's shirt. There was a heavy blush on her face that Issei could not see. It was then when it fully dawned on the brown-haired devil that everyone else was there. He released Asia immediately and took a step back. Bekendo giggled. Ria's cleared her throat. She sat at her desk, a book open in front of her. Seeing how she has twilight healing, I figured she would make a good addition. Her words would have annoyed Issei just yesterday, but right now he was too happy about Asia being alive for a negative thought of any kind. Now, I believe one of my regulars is expecting me. Kiba said. Hideo Kaneko spoke up. They were both gone a moment later. Ria's didn't acknowledge their departure. Rather, she turned to her queen. Akeno, could you please help Asia with her schedule? Of course, said Queen replied with a smile. Issei and Ria's were now alone. In the back of his mind, Issei wondered if she had planned that. We were all very worried when you collapsed after your fight. Ria still didn't think that was the right thing to call it. That made Issei remember. He was so distracted that he had completely forgotten about the biggest part of last night. Rainer, what happened to her? He asked. I eliminated her. Honestly, I think it was mercy, considering what she was going through. Oh. Are you okay with that? The brunette didn't answer for a moment. Yes. She had to be killed. He would be lying if he said he didn't wish that he was the one to do it. Ria's didn't look like she quite believed him. Good. Now that we're alone, I need to talk to you about a few things. Okay, Issei wasn't entirely sure he liked where this was going. Now that Asia is a devil, she will need a more permanent place to stay. When I asked her about where she would like to live, her first idea was with you. Would you be okay with that? Of course. Just let me call my parents. No need. I can take care of it. She gave him that smile that never failed to make him uneasy. Though he was more concerned about what she had said before that. Wait, did you say I was the first person that she thought of? Yes. It seems you've made quite the impression on her in your short time together. She really appreciated you coming to save her. Issei looked away, a slight blush on his face. The others did more than me. Maybe so, but they would not have even been there if it wasn't for you. Speaking of that, Issei said, happy to change the subject. What exactly happened at the end? It's all pretty fuzzy after Asia, you know. Ria's face darkened. Issei, I'm sure you're aware of the effect you have on people. Issei didn't respond verbally. I think I know why now. You do? The brunette devil couldn't hide his eagerness. Yes. She sighed. It's been called many names throughout history, but the one that seemed to stick is Corrupt Eternity. You seem to be the most likely candidate for the latest user. The infinite void of ruin is the source of your frightening aura, Issei. Or was, rather. That makes sense. You've heard of this too, Drake. Just by name. One of my hosts has never come into contact with it, thankfully. Issei was going to ask the dragon what he meant, but the crimson-haired devil began talking again. I wish I could be certain before telling you all of this, but until you try to use it further, there isn't much I can do. Corrupt eternity manifests itself in different ways, and there aren't even many to compare you to in the first place. Why not? Because, Issei, most who have this power don't survive nearly as long as you have. Most go insane almost directly after using it for the first time, going on a rampage before eventually being put down. Upon seeing his startled expression, Riaz continued in a futile attempt to calm her pawn down. But that isn't all of them, and you have already proved to be different. For now, we should remain optimistic. Foolish. Issei chose not to answer the dragon. Wait, why did you mean by it was the source of the aura? Riaz smirked. Don't tell me you didn't notice that nobody was affected by you when you walked in. Issei's eyes slightly widened. You mean? Yes. It seems that your aura is gone. For now, at least. You should be able to have a more normal school life going forward. Now, I want you to go home and get some rest. We'll discuss this more later. She said, right back to her normal demeanor. Issei would be more than happy to oblige that request. He opened the door before stopping and turning back to his master. Riaz? He called. Yes. Thank you for saving Asia. After I failed. Don't worry about it, Issei. Oh. And one more thing. The pawn looked back at her. I wanted to say I'm sorry for. Issei cut her off with a hand. Riaz, temporarily stunned by the action, actually stopped talking. He sighed. I don't want an apology, Riaz. Her response of what do you want then? Died on her tongue when he closed the door. On a tree outside of the old school building, a red and yellow bird was perched, piercing blue eyes staring into the room from a window. Once Issei had left, it flew away. Riaz sighed as she sat down at her desk. There would be even more problems for Issei Hyoudou as a devil going forward, ones that Riaz had failed to warn him of. The most well-known wielder of corrupt eternity was from the Great War period. It executed thousands of devils, angels, and fallen angels in its time. It had to be responsible for wiping out at least 3 of the pillar families single-handedly. The rest of the surviving devil families will not look favorably on Issei Hyoudou. And she had no idea how to prepare for that. Of all the things to happen on his way home, Drake talking to him wasn't one that Issei expected. Are you sure about this, Hyoudou? Sure about what? Letting this girl close to the people you care about. Yes, why wouldn't I be? This wouldn't be the first time the church used an innocent-looking nun to kill someone. Asia wouldn't do that. I'm sure you thought the same thing about the fallen angel. Tell me, how did that turn out? Issei ground his teeth in an attempt to stop the anger. This is different. How so? Asia saved my life by jumping in front of Freed. She put herself in danger for me. Why would she do that if the end goal is to kill me? It could have been an act for this very purpose. She might also need information on your master. There are countless explanations. You aren't changing my mind on this. Asia is a good person. I am aware. You throw all logic out when you get attached to someone. For someone so recently murdered for trusting someone you knew nothing about, you seem eager to let it happen again. Issei did not respond. A surprisingly mundane life carried on for the next few weeks, even with a new person he still barely knew in his house. Issei was focused on recovering for the first few days, but after that he returned to the same routine he had since becoming a devil. Though now he had Asia with him to hand out flyers. Despite his aura being under control now, she still had much more success approaching people than he did. Thankfully, his parents were receptive to Asia right away. They had always wanted a girl anyway, so he supposed that wasn't surprising. As had become normal recently, he and Asia were preparing to hand out flyers in the hopes of getting contracts. In the few short weeks since becoming a devil, Asia had already passed Issei in contracts. We're going to hand out flyers now. Issei announced as he handed a bag of flyers over to Asia, keeping one for himself. Actually, Issei, Riaz said. I think you'll be glad to hear that your days of handing out flyers are over. Really? Yes. I think you have a good enough idea of how the job works. And handing out flyers is usually the role of a familiar anyway. What's a familiar? Would you die for me? A flash of light. A scream. The bed creaked in protest. Shallow, ragged breathing filled the one silent room. In what was frustratingly still a common occurrence, Issei Hyoudou woke up covered in sweat. And terrified of someone who didn't exist anymore. Again? Why does this keep happening? I thought after she died. You haven't moved on. What? From what caused you to become a devil? She will continue to haunt you until you find closure. I don't suppose you have any ideas on how I can do that. Inner peace can only be found by yourself. I was asking for advice, not a proverb. Why does it even matter to you anyway? My consciousness resides within you, Hyoudou. I also see your terrors. It gets rather annoying after a while. Of course. Can't be thinking you actually care. There was a brief moment of silence inside his mind. By the way, what do you think of this corrupt eternity? If it can be used to complement the boosted gear's abilities, then it should prove beneficial. Past that, I do not care. Issei didn't know what he expected from the dragon. It was probably something along those lines. Issei? Are you okay? The brunette's head jerked over to his door, only to see emerald green eyes filled with concern staring back at him. Asia? He was still getting used to her living with him. I heard a noise, and then you're… Oh, it's nothing. I'm fine, thanks. Okay. Well, breakfast is almost ready, so come down soon. We have a very important date today. I'm so happy your mom is teaching me how to cook. She said, the last part more to herself than to him as she turned around and left the room. Issei didn't know what exactly Riaz had done to convince his parents to let Asia stay with them, but it had led to his mom teaching Asia how to cook, clean, and complete other various tasks around the house. He was more focused on what she said before that. He was not sure why today was important. What's a familiar? Familiars are creatures that perform various tasks for us devils, from gathering information to handing out contract flyers to even combat purposes. It's a basic requirement for new devils to get one. This is my familiar. As Riaz finished her sentence, a bat-like creature appeared, hovering above her shoulder. It looked familiar to him, somehow. His hunch was confirmed when the bat transformed in front of him and turned into a girl with short black hair, wearing a red and white dress. Yeah, she was definitely someone that he had seen before. You're the girl that gave me the flyer. Is she? Interesting, Riaz commented. In the back of his mind, Issei wondered why that was interesting. Before he could ponder that further, his attention was put back onto the familiar. The girl had disappeared just as quickly as she appeared. The small bat creature was once again flying behind Ria's shoulder. Of course, I have one as well. Akeno said as an imp appeared on the floor next to her. Not long after that, they were joined by a white bird and cat, belonging to Kiba and Kaneko, respectively. While Asia gushed over how cute the familiars were, Issei turned to Riaz. How do we get a familiar? The school day was an interesting experience for Issei Hyoudou, to say the least. First, there was no recoil or sudden stiffness when he walked into the classroom, which he had come to expect from everyone in the room except for Asia, the only friend he had in the class. He expected that part though, with the effect being gone. What he didn't expect is what else transpired throughout the school day. Second, throughout the whole day, he was treated like everyone else, for lack of a better term. No glances of disdain or fear, no attempts to stay as far away from him as possible. The teacher even called on him a few times. They just treated him like any other student, like he was normal. Completely normal. It was difficult not to smile to himself all the time. Not difficult enough because something still nagged at him. All of them had treated him like the plague for weeks, and now everything was fine. Wouldn't they question why it suddenly didn't feel weird to be around him? Why were they acting as if they owe? Riaz had mentioned that she would do something about his class situation, but he didn't expect this. He didn't expect for her to change the memory of an entire class, and probably a lot more not in his class. Moments like these were when he was reminded just how terrifying Ria's Gremory could be. In the end, he decided the less he thought about it, the better it would be. The less scared of his master he would be, anyway. If only he could actually get his brain to think less about it, he'd be able to follow through with that idea. His thoughts still revolved around the school day during his walk to the old school building. Usually Asia would be there to drag him out of his thoughts, but she was talking to Kiryu after school, so Issei elected to head over alone. Asia had been talking to Kiryu more and more lately, now that he thought about it. He hoped that she didn't change Asia too much. When Issei got to the club room, he was surprised to find it completely empty. Usually at least 2 of the club members were present by the time Issei arrived. Seeing it empty was an odd sight for the new devil. Oh, hello. He turned around. Akeno. Good afternoon. She smiled. As if sensing what his next question would be, she spoke again. Riaz is gone preparing for the familiar trip. It's just us for now. He could have sworn he heard her tone change in the last sentence. He had to be just imagining it, right? Okay. Alright, you don't have a problem with that, do you? She was right next to him now. It was as if she was enjoying his discomfort. Basking in it, almost. She probably was. No, of course not. Akeno giggled. She leaned in closer to him. Too close. Instinctively, Issei backed up until he backed up into one of the couches. Akeno followed him. Issei, emerald eyes looked at the situation in confusion. Asia. It's not what it looks like. He looked over at Asia, who was doing a very poor job of hiding her discontent with the situation she walked into, and then back to Akeno, who had moved even closer to the point that their noses were nearly touching. He stared straight into violet eyes and a beautiful face framed by long black hair. The last time he saw a face like that. Would you die for me? Issei jerked away from Akeno, fear seeping into his eyes. Both girls present suddenly went rigid for a few seconds. Even if he hadn't felt it himself, Issei would have known that it was his effect on others showing up again. Does this mean it isn't fully gone? But it was supposed to be, right? Akeno, what exactly is going on in here? That was how they learned Rias had returned. After Rias ensured that they would tell her what was happening when she arrived later, they headed out to the forest. Though headed out wasn't the right phrasing, considering the travel was instantaneous. Issei blinked. Once. Instead of the school building, they were in a dark forest. What the hell? This is the familiar forest. Rias announced. Where do we go from here? Issei asked. We have to wait for the familiar master. You called? A new voice asked. Every head turned to the forest clearing, where a man was standing. Saying that the man looked odd would be like saying Drake was a lizard. If you're looking for familiars, you've come to the right place. Absent-mindedly, Issei thought he looked similar to a character from a show he had watched as a child. The familiar master informed them about every different kind of familiar in the forest as he led them down the path. Or at least that's what Issei thought he did, because he wasn't paying very good attention to the man. Rather, he was looking at the trees, his mind still focused on what happened with Akeno. He needed to apologize to her. And Asia, for that matter. Nobody should have to feel that. Not paying attention had caused him to fall behind the rest of the group. Issei. His head snapped forward to see that Rias had slowed down and was now next to him. Oh. Sorry. Still thinking about what happened in the clubroom? Most likely for a completely different reason than she was imagining, but still, he supposed she was right. You'll have to forgive Akeno for her behavior from earlier. She's a bit of a tease. Oh, it's no problem. He quickly replied. A small smile played on Ria's face. I'm sure it isn't. I didn't mean it like that. Rias chuckled. I know you didn't, Issei. I was just joking. The silence fell between them for a minute. Rias? Yes. Do you know how the effect came back for a few seconds back there? I was wondering about that. Her face changed into one deep in thought. The only reason I can think of is that it was reactivated by an extreme influx of emotions. A lot of sacred gears are fueled by emotions, after all. That made sense to him. He's just got to keep his emotions in check and he'll be fine. Easier said than done. Issei? Rias asked, bringing him out of his thoughts. Yeah? If you don't mind me asking, what caused that to happen? What emotion were you feeling? A squeal distracted both of them and saved Issei from having to answer. They both started walking forward at a quickened pace to see what was going on. When he got there, he saw Asia crouching near a blue dragon. It's so cute. Issei didn't know if cute was the best word to describe it. The thing looked pretty menacing. Especially when it was glaring daggers at him. I think it senses him. Rias told Issei. What do you mean? The red dragon. It senses Drake. Other dragons can feel his aura. The dragon is scared of you and will probably be rather hostile. I wouldn't go near him if I were you. Wasn't planning on it, Issei said, before something to his right caught his attention. Ah, a sprite dragon. Yes, very cute. Though they are known to be quite aggressive, even uncontrollable if not tamed early on in their development. The familiar master added. I think I'll call him Issei. Nobody present commented on how familiar the name was. So, that's one familiar down, now we only have one left, Issei. Rias looked back down the trail. The teen wasn't facing them. His attention was taken by something else from the trees that he was looking at. The small grey dragon was staring back at Issei. The brown-haired devil took a step towards it and the dragon, despite looking skeptical, didn't move. He took another. And another. Soon, he was crouching in front of the dragon. Issei slowly moved a hand out and petted the dragon's head. The dragon looked hesitant at first, evidently trying to see if the devil was a threat or not. Seemingly deciding it wasn't, the dragon nuzzled into Issei's hand. I think it likes you. Issei looked over his shoulder to see Rias and Asia looking at him and the familiar, who was now licking his hand. The female sprite. Much more passive. Probably better for you. The familiar master said, looking over at Issei, who was still glaring at everyone that wasn't Asia. Have you made your choice, Issei? Rias asked. Yeah, I think I have. Issei picked the dragon up into his hands. Any idea for what you want to name her? Said familiar sneezed and shocked Issei. Not enough to cause the devil serious pain of any kind, but enough to show that she is definitely a sprite dragon. I was thinking Storm would be a good name. In the time since being chosen, Asia's familiar had warmed up a little to the rest of the club. Except for Issei. Despite doing all he could to be nice to the new dragon, it still acted hostile towards him. A couple other members of the occult research club had brought their familiars out, though they had little interaction with each other, mostly because Kaneko's cat seemed content sitting in its master's lap, and Issei still didn't seem to like anyone that much besides Asia. After another series of failed attempts to win over the new familiar, Issei had given up and went over to where Rias was to talk to her for a few minutes. Asia seems happy. He commented. Yes, it's as if she has gotten a new pet. Rias agreed. She has, in many ways. Issei looked over at said familiar, who Asia was still gushing over. Why do you think he hates me? I think he senses your gear. Rias told him. What do you mean? The red dragon. It senses Drake. Other dragons can feel his aura. Issei sees you as a threat and will probably be defensive for a while. I would stay away from him for the time being if I were you. I'll keep that in mind, but he looks like he's okay now. Asia seems to have calmed him down. For whatever reason, he's not aggressive when he's around her. Issei felt it too. The former nun just had a calming atmosphere around her. So far, he's only noticed it with himself and the familiar. He wondered why that was. Speaking of that, she continued. Why don't you have yours here? He looked back over the crimson-haired girl next to him. She wasn't in the best of shape when I found her. I figured it'd be best to let her rest for a while. Yes, of course. That makes sense, she responded. Issei looked at her oddly. Something was off. Riaz looked like she was holding herself back from saying something. Riaz? Yeah? She asked, louder than necessary. Had the others not been preoccupied with their familiars, they probably would have been alerted. Is something bothering you? No, can I ask you a question, Issei? Sure. What do you think about love? She blurted out. What the hell? Issei didn't really knew what he was expecting her to ask, but it wasn't that. You don't have to answer it if you don't want to. No, I think it sounds pretty nice. He finally stammered out. Yes, pretty nice, Riaz repeated, eyes towards the floor. Much better than Issei trailed off, mind filled with unwanted images of dark hair and even darker wings. Then what? Issei shook his head. Never mind. It's nothing. He smiled while saying that, something she assumed was intended to be reassuring. Instead, it just looked like the saddest thing she had ever seen. Oh. She said, quietly. Okay. Ria's question bounced around Issei's head for most of the day, any other thoughts eventually being pushed to the side as his mind kept going around in circles, beginning and ending with what she had asked him. Hours later, he was still thinking about it. All Issei was really hoping for at this point was a quiet end to his night. That wish died almost instantly when a red circle lit up on the floor beside his bed. Why is the world so cruel to him sometimes? One night wasn't too much to ask, was it? Issei relaxed when he saw it was only Riaz. But there was still something about her that was off. Riaz, I need you to take my virginity. Issei blinked once. Twice. He found that he lacked the ability to formulate a sentence. Riaz was already taking her skirt off. She climbed onto his bed. Hurry up, we don't have much time. Riaz, Issei. She cut him off, impatience starting to creep into her voice. This isn't that difficult. Just do what you're told. She started fumbling with his clothes next, completely ignoring his attempts to figure out what exactly brought this on. The noise outside his room made Issei keenly aware of the three others in the house. Especially Asia. If she were to investigate a noise or the magical presence from the transportation circle in his room was and stumbled upon this, the brunette devil didn't even want to think about what a reaction would be. Riaz pulled his shirt slightly up, exposing part of his stomach. His hands flew to her wrists and caught them in a firm grasp, surprising the heiress. As well as himself, if he was being honest. Riaz, he said, voice little more than a whisper in fear of alerting someone else in the house. We can't do this. His actions seemed to have a bit of an effect on the princess. Her eyes slowly came into focus on him, as if she was just now realizing the extent of her actions. Issei, she said, voice barely audible. You're right, Light shone in the dark room once again as another magic circle lit the floor, this one a more gray color. Really, Riaz, I knew you were desperate, but not this much. A new voice said. Riaz shook her head. I was too late. The two teens were joined by a beautiful gray-haired woman. She stepped forward, and Issei was surprised to see she was wearing a maid outfit. The woman paid him no attention. She was busy staring at Riaz with a disappointed look. Surziches will be disappointed in you. The new woman noted, voice matching her face, completely void of emotion. Who is that? I don't care what he thinks. Riaz shot back. I am free to do what I please. You know this, Grafia, yet you still came here to interrupt me. I came here to prevent you from making a mistake. I'm not making one. Could you guys keep it down? Issei asked in a hushed tone. His eyes frantically looked over to the door. Grafia looked at him for the first time. Out of the corner of her eye it was only for a moment, but Issei had to fight not shiver. She said nothing to him and turned her attention back to Riaz. Duly noted. She bent over to pick up Riaz's discarded skirt and took another few steps to the heiress, handing it to her. Riaz snatched it out of her hands. Still though, for it to be with him you are the next head of the House of Gremory. Try to have some respect for yourself. Grafia turned to Issei and addressed him. My apologies for the intrusion. My name is Grafia, I am in service of the Gremory family. We will be leaving shortly. Didn't she just insult me? What's with the formal introduction? Grafia went back to ignoring Issei, either not expecting or not caring for a response. Riaz, now fully clothed again, turned back to her newest servant. I'm so sorry for this, Issei. I haven't been in my right mind today. Issei? Grafia now looked at the brunette devil with a hint of interest on her features. The one who possesses the boosted gear is this boy. Back to the thinly veiled insults. If he wasn't so overwhelmed, Issei would have been slightly upset. Yes, this is my new pawn. We will talk further at the clubroom. They both disappeared into a magic circle, leaving a very confused Issei behind. He wouldn't be getting much sleep tonight. It took Asia entering Issei's room 3 times to get him up the next day. After a quick breakfast, an obligatory scolding from his mother, which was hard for her, as she couldn't be happier with the current Asia situation, and Asia assuring her it was no issue, the two devils took off for school. On the way there, Issei barely paid attention to what Asia was saying, he was too busy wondering how Riaz would act after what happened. Riaz had seemingly decided that pretending last night didn't happen was the right way to go, which only made the awkwardness that much worse. Everyone else in the club noticed the differences, but none of them said anything. Out of kindness or not having a clue about what was different, Issei didn't know. He was thankful nonetheless. He was about to ask if he could leave when he saw a magic circle appear out of the corner of his eye. A moment later, it felt like the entire room was filled with flames. "I've returned, my dear Riaz." A voice rang out. Issei didn't know what to think, to be honest. He was still in the occult research club room, but he was now joined by several others, all not a part of the club. He was standing by most of the other club members, all of whom except Asia, who was just as confused as him, were sending totally not glares at the new people. Namely Riser Phoenix, third heir to the Phoenix clan, one of the few pillar families left. More importantly, Ria's fiancée. Judging by the look that had been on his king's face since he arrived, she wasn't a willing participant in the engagement. Riser had immediately sat down next to her and was busy running his hands through her hair, up and down her arm, her leg, basically wherever he could grab. Behind Riser and Riaz, on the other side of the room, were Riser's own set of evil pieces. 14 of them, all female, all insanely cute. They were all giving mocking smiles to Issei and the rest of the club. It was starting to get on the brunette devil's nerves. "What are you doing here, Riser? I thought that Surzich's told you to stop visiting me." She finally asked, face still looked like she was about to vomit at any moment. "He merely said that I couldn't show up without telling you and him. Which I did do, in case you forgot," he said, motioning over to Grafia, who stood silently off to the side. Issei had barely noticed when she arrived slightly after Riser. "And I don't see what the issue is. I'm just making sure that this place is good enough for my fiancé. While I do detest that you would come to live here, the least I could do is make sure it isn't as horrid as most of the overworld." "Please," Riaz snorted. "If you want to keep tabs on me, at least come up with a better excuse." Riser chuckled, not responding to her question. "You." He looked over to Akeno, who was standing over by Riaz instead of by the rest of her pieces. "Bring me some tea, will you? I've been dying to try some." The arrogance radiated off of every word. Akeno gave him a half glare, but still went to the kitchen area. Scratch that, Issei knew what to think now. He really didn't like this guy. When Akeno returned with the tea, she left it on the table in front of Riser, moving away from him as quickly as a proper walk would allow her to. He took a sip. "Delicious," he smirked. As expected of Myria's queen. This was really starting to piss him. "Issei," Asia whispered. The brunette devil looked over to see the rest of the club were all looking at him with worry. And a bit of fear. He had almost forgotten what that was like. "What? Your effect, it's back." Kiba responded. "Can you stop it?" "What? How is it back?" "I imagine it is because your emotions are flaring up. Control yourself, Hyoudou. The bird is far too powerful for you to beat right now." Almost on cue, the target of his ire turned his head to look at him. This one is new. Are you trying to intimidate me with that aura, boy?" Issei said nothing. He couldn't even hide his glare now. Riser chuckled again. "You really should keep your servants under control, Riaz, before someone not as forgiving as I am puts them down." "Enough!" Riaz exclaimed. She stood up and took a step away from her fiancé. "What part of I have no intention to marry you do you not understand?" "My darling," he drawled, smirk not leaving his face. "You're still at this? It's been a few years now, don't you think you should accept it already? We are still trying to repopulate purebreds from the Great War, my family especially." Issei saw Ria's eyes flick to him for a second when Riser said that. "Besides," he continued, "I don't believe your family is in any condition to decline this marriage. They cannot afford for you to be so selfish. Don't bring my family into this. Their hastiness got us into this predicament anyway." "Besides," Riaz said, smirking for the first time since Riser arrived. "I think I can do better than a third heir, don't you?" The ever-present smirk on Riser's face was wiped off in an instant. He shot up to his feet, glaring at Riaz. "How dare. There is no reason for this to get hostile." Grafia suddenly stepped in. "I am here by order of Surzich's. He told me to ensure this stayed peaceful." Riser looked at her, then back at Riaz. "TCH, whatever." Despite what he said, it was obvious he was shaken by what Grafia said. Lord Surzich's anticipated this would not go smoothly. He said that should communications break down and Ria stay adamant on not marrying Riser, that you two would settle it in a rating game. The entire room looked shocked at this. Really? Riser said, as if he was trying not to outright laugh. I have already won 3 games, while Ria's has never even qualified. She is a rating game virgin, so to speak. He said, ignoring Ria's angry expression. He looked back over at the teenage devils. Are these all of your servants, Ria's? And if they are? Riser couldn't hold back a chuckle this time. Then this will be an easy victory. Don't underestimate us, Riser. We will annihilate you. He smirked. I look forward to it. Riser joined his peerage, and after a few seconds, they were gone. Leaving flames behind them. Rafia told Ria she would have a few weeks to prepare for the game before leaving to inform Surziches of what happened. Nobody else, save for Ria's, stayed much longer. The next time Issei was in the clubroom was about a week later when Ria's called for her entire peerage. The crimson-haired devils had no trace of the usual friendliness on her face. It was complete seriousness when she addressed them all. Be prepared to leave soon. We will begin training for the rating game against Riser. Issei didn't see his fellow devils very often over the few days leading up to their departure for rating game training. For the most part, this was because Ria's wasn't around much, being busy with arranging the training. He had been told that most of her time was taken up by it, and the time that wasn't was taken up by school, contracts, and watching over Kuo. Now that he thought about it, she had a ton to do on a daily basis. Ever since his effect had gone away, Issei had learned how to use a basic transportation circle from Akeno and gotten a few contracts. Since he no longer had to pass out flyers, he didn't have many reasons to go to the club room. The next time they were all gathered together again was when they were nearing time to leave. Riaz was explaining that it had been decided that the game would take place a month after it was announced, which was almost a week ago now. Leaving them 3 to prepare. Issei was alternating between talking to Asia and marveling at how much Kaneko could eat when a knock rang out from the large doors to the club. A moment later, it was opened, revealing several new people, all of whom Issei didn't recognize. He thought some of them looked vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place his finger on it. Once they all entered, Issei was able to count 8 of them, all but 1 female. Oh, hello Sona. Was there something you needed? The one his king addressed, Sona, gave a bit of a chuckle. Next to her was another girl with similar black hair and glasses, except her hair was much longer. The rest of the group was a few steps behind them. Ah, that's who she was. The president of the student council. That didn't explain why she came to the orc, though. Speaking of that, he noticed the sole male of the group not so subtly checking out every female member of the occult research club. Since I probably won't be seeing you again until after the rating game, I wanted to wish you good luck. Plus, I never had the chance to meet your new servants. She knows about the game, then? That would mean they're all devils, too. Is she also a devil? Asia asked behind him. An affirmative response from Kiba confirmed Issei's guess. Thank you Sona. Riaz continued. I hope that means you'll cover for all of us here for the few weeks we'll be gone. Naturally. Sona and Tsubaki, her queen he guessed, continued with chatter that was more formal than friendly, but Issei wasn't listening to their conversation anymore. He noticed that the guy, he was pretty sure Sona had said his name was Saji, had taken the liberty of introducing himself to Asia. The former nun was laughing, completely oblivious to his obvious flirting and ogling gaze. He wasn't sure why, but he didn't really like this guy the second he looked at him. The blonde devil shook her hand and held on far longer than he needed to. Eventually, Saji noticed him watching. Probably understanding what was angering the brown-haired devil, the student council member only winked at him. Ooh, I think you made him angry, Saji. I think so too, Haruko. Issei was doing his best not to let it bother him. He really was. But the guy was walking towards him now, and Issei felt his annoyance growing with every step. Is that you, Vritra? What? One of the 5 dragon kings. As well as the probable reason for your aversion to the boy. Hyoudou, was it? You're the new pawn, aren't you? He asked. Yeah. Saji looked him up and down. And snorted. Well, I guess not every pawn can be like me. I took 4 pieces to reincarnate. He said proudly. I took 8. The grin faltered. What? Riaz reincarnated me with 8 pawns. He repeated. You took up 8 pieces. How is that even possible? Issei shrugged. Don't ask me. You're right, though. I guess not every pawn can be like you. Saji, unsurprisingly, was sulking over by the rest of Sona's peerage for the rest of the time she was there. When the Citri peerage had left, Riaz turned to everyone. So then, everybody ready to leave. Once the familiar red glow from the transportation circle faded, Issei took in his new surroundings. Instead of the Victorian-style design of the club room, they now stood in front of a large mansion. I was able to secure a pretty sizable piece of land for us to use. Issei looked over to Riaz. Where are we, exactly? The underworld. I suppose this is your first time here. Welcome to hell, I guess. This is hell. Yep. It doesn't feel like hell. He heard Kiba chuckle behind him. What did you think hell would feel like? Riaz asked. Thinking about it, what generally came to mind when one would think of hell was pretty unrealistic. I don't know, but not this. He gestured to the beautiful surroundings. There is plenty of time to look at the scenery later. We have to unpack now. Riaz said. And that was all they needed. Issei looked around his room. It was large. Too much so for what he needed. Or cared for, if he was being honest. The entire mansion, in all honesty, was much larger than it needed to be. It stood 4 floors tall, and there were only 6 of them. Because of this, they could spread out a bit when picking their rooms. Riaz and Akeno were on the 2nd floor, Kaneko and Kiba on the 3rd, and Asia and himself occupied the 4th. The breakfast, he was pretty sure it was cooked by Akeno, was delicious. All of the talk at the table was related to their upcoming training. What they would be doing, what they wanted to improve on, any tips the others could give, etc. Issei, being too busy wolfing down the food to participate much into the conversations, mostly listened to parts of it. What about you, Issei? Honestly, I've been curious about Corrupt Eternity. I want to figure out exactly what it can do. He heard Riaz sigh after he said that. Perhaps we should get this out of the way now. Get what out of the way? I don't want you using Corrupt Eternity during the raiding game. What? That made no sense. What the hell? Why not? Because you don't need to put yourself in danger trying to use it. We're already at a huge disadvantage. We're going to need all the help we can get. Why wouldn't I use it? This is final, Issei. Issei was more confused and disappointed than anything, but shook his head and gave a whatever in response before heading out. He'd try to get her to change her mind later, anyway. Riaz had explained the mansion grounds were set up with several individual training stations that catered to the strengths of each. Issei's was mostly open area, with a few training dummies scattered about. Boost. His first boost rang out, echoing in the open area. Issei felt the familiar doubling of his power course through his veins. What else can this thing do, Drag? Apart from the flames. He heard what sounded like a chuckle come from the dragon. I was wondering when you would ask. As with all sacred gears, the boosted gear is an extension of the user's will. Issei always found that reasoning to be stupid. But he had stopped questioning things like that ever since he became a devil. And in the very limited interactions he's had with Drag, he had found the dragon to be correct most of the time. So, without hesitation, Issei closed his eyes and started to focus. In his gauntlet-clad hand, a red ball of energy, starting small but steadily increasing, started pulsing. Issei willed it to fire towards one of the dummies. Dragon shot. Safe to say, there was nothing left of the dummy after that. Or a lot of the ground around it, for that matter. Within a few hours, all of the dummies and most of the surrounding landscape would be charred or blown to bits. Thankfully, Riaz had mentioned the training stations regenerated overnight. One thing Issei was not prepared for was the utter exhaustion he felt almost every night. Given how important this was for her nearly eternal lifetime, Riaz was taking this seriously, as one would expect, and had spent days planning the weeks of training in order to ensure her peerage didn't waste so much as a second. Issei looked around the room. He was usually out cold from exhaustion within a few minutes of entering the room, so he had never taken that great of a look at it. From his spot on the bed, he took in the desk in the corner, the large windows that let in a bit of moonlight, the shadows that seemed to dance around the room. Issei could almost hear them calling out to him. Cries that seemed to follow him everywhere where there was darkness. Let's test this out, shall we? Even if Riaz didn't want him to use it in the game, he was still curious about this power. He had figured out so much of the boosted gear's abilities, it would only make sense to do the same for his other power, right? He willed the shadows to start moving. They began to move in a circle around the room, picking up speed by the second. Issei was glad he was relatively secluded from the others. He should be able to test this out in peace. Come closer. Immediately, the darkness started moving closer to him. Issei strained, forcing it to come closer and closer until it was within his reach. More shadows, these ones emerging from somewhere behind him, joined the ones he was already controlling and swirling around until it had formed a fluctuating, transparent wall of sorts. He started to reach his hand out. Whether he would have listened to the centuries-old dragon in his head or not, Issei couldn't say for sure, but it didn't matter, since it was too late for him to stop. He felt something resembling a tug when his hand made contact with them. A second later, pain. Unbelievable pain erupted inside of him, starting where his fingers met them and shooting up through his arm and to his head. Issei immediately pulled his arm back as hard as he could, scampered back until his back was up against his bed. The shadows had retreated back to their original locations, lurking in the corners of his room. All that could be heard was his ragged breathing. Issei stood about 10 feet apart from Kiba. Riaz stood several feet back, facing both of them. This duel will end either when one participant gives up or is otherwise defeated. You are both to use only the basics of your abilities. And try not to injure one another. Understand? They both nodded. The second Riaz signaled for them to begin, Issei summoned the boosted gear. Boost. Sword birth. Dozens of swords ripped out of the ground at Kiba's feet. What the hell? Issei had always assumed that Kiba had swords in a pocket dimension of something else that went against everything he knew about physics. He wasn't expecting the blonde to be able to summon them out of the ground. No matter, though. Boost. Sword clashed with gauntlet as the two teenage devils fought to overpower the other. Boost. It seemed that Issei was just fast enough to block his attacks, and Kiba was just fast enough to dodge the brunette's counter blows. Another couple of boosts later, Issei was able to push him back a few feet. Dragon shot. The attack tore through everything in its path, but missed the intended target, who had gotten out of the way. Kiba seemingly came out of thin air to his left, and Issei was forced to use his wings for a large jump out of the way. Issei held back a growl. A moment later, several whirlwinds of flame were hurled directly at the knight. Kiba pulled out two new swords, each identical to the other and seemingly coated in ice. Flame delete. To the brunette devil's disbelief, Kiba didn't attempt to use his speed to get out of the way of the fire. Instead, he simply pulled out another sword and cut through them. One slice, and the flames were gone. Out of the corner of his eye, Issei noticed shadows under the trees around them. He could almost hear them again. Maybe it was imagination. Maybe, if he called out to them. No. Can't do that. Not again. Issei felt something hit him in the side. Hard. Half a second later, he was on the ground and the sword was pressed up against his throat. Riaz called the duel over at the same time Drake called him a fool. In the time he had wasted thinking about the shadows like an idiot, Kiba had appeared to his side and made him pay for getting distracted. The knight had the same smile on his face that had gained him the affection of most of the female population at Kuo. Issei was pretty sure he didn't do a very good job of hiding the frustration on his face. Stupid damn grin. Kiba offered his hand to help him up, but Issei refused it. He was barely paying attention to the Asia's words of encouragement or Ria's warnings of getting distracted during battle. Once he had adjusted to the exhaustion, the roughly 20 days of training had passed quickly. Before he knew it, the raiding game was almost upon them. Over the last couple of weeks, he had seen the strides everyone had taken. Kiba was faster, Kaneko was stronger, Asia's healing was more effective, Akeno and Ria's magical attacks were far better. Even himself. Issei's max amount of boosts were heavily increased, he found it much easier to control the fire. Yet, he wasn't really sure if it would be enough to defeat their opponents. The number and experience advantage was heavily in favor of their opponents, which was the main reason they got this long to train. Supposedly some of the devils found this to be favoritism. Reiser's peerage had to be stronger than them, right? It only made sense. Riaz had mentioned that Reiser assembled his peerage based on his fetishes, but there were 14 of them, and they have to have some amount of combat ability. Reiser would not have been able to win multiple raiding games without that, which meant that Issei had to do more. He had to gain power, by any means necessary. Just then, Issei heard his door open, and a head of blonde hair peeked in. Asia? Hi Issei. Was she blushing? Do you need anything? No, not really. Just can I stay here for a bit? Sure. You're nervous? Yes, a little. She admitted. She sat down next to him on the bed. Reiser's peerage looked really strong. There are so many more of them and I'm not much use in a fight. I'll protect you. He said, almost reflexively. What? I'll keep you safe during the game. You don't have to worry. Just like I saved you back at the church, remember? A small smile played across the former nun's face. She moved then, and Issei now found her frame pressed up against his. Asia. Now what did Kiryu say to do next, she mumbled to herself. Kiryu? In the time since he was no longer hated and feared by the masses, Issei had gotten acquainted with most of the students in his class. Most of them initially talked to him out of pity, but it was nice regardless. He knew they couldn't comprehend him having a supernatural effect for weeks, then suddenly not anymore. He imagined they had tried to rationalize it by thinking they had shunned him for being new or something like that, and now felt bad. He didn't know any of them, save for Asia, well enough that he would consider them friends, but he knew enough about them. A few stuck out more than others, namely Mitsuda, Motohama, and Ika Kiryu. He didn't know what she told Asia, but whatever it was, he was sure it probably wasn't good advice for her to take. His thoughts about classmates came to a screeching halt when he felt Asia's lips press against his own. It wasn't much more than a peck. She pulled back out of embarrassment a moment later. Issei was still too frozen to do anything. I am sorry. I don't know, she was cut off when the brunette pulled her into his arms. Don't be. He murmured. On the night before the raiding game, Issei found himself unable to sleep. Several things, most prominent one being the game itself, raced through his mind. But that wasn't even what was troubling him the most. Yet again, he could hear the faint cry of the shadows all around him. It followed him everywhere at this point. He never heard them like this before. Why was it happening now, of all times, when he needed to focus? Leaving his room to get a glass of water revealed to him that he wasn't the only one struggling to sleep, as he saw Ria's grimoire out on the patio outside of the kitchen. She turned her head to him when he opened the glass door and stepped outside. Can't sleep either. He shook his head. Join me, then. I have a new idea for out strategy that I'd like to run by someone. So, what do you think? Well, I'm not going to pretend to be much of a strategist. But if you think it will work, then we should go for it. He answered after a moment, getting an absent-minded hum in response. You've worked really hard on this. He noted. Yes, but I worry it won't be enough. They have the edge in numbers, experience, and teamwork, so our only real chance is to outwit them and work as a team. The heiress smiled a bit. It was probably the saddest smile Issei had seen in his life. Don't say things like that. He said, confusing her. Huh? Believing is half the battle, right? If there was one thing Anime had taught him, it was that. Riaz chuckled at that. You know, she said, a minute later. Nobody thinks we have a chance tomorrow. All of them just think this is all just a tantrum. Indulging in a child's whining. Let's prove them wrong, then. End of the here. So that's it for today's video guys. Before you go, just like the video and share it with your friends. Bye.